Welcome everyone to the Horticultural Gardens. This is a part of campus that I'm sure you haven't seen too often on your travels, but it's one that's well worth visiting because it's really interesting at all sorts of times of the year. On the back of the Horticultural Gardens as well, there are the Harris Gardens, which are just ornamental, but they're a really lovely part of the university. And on a nice sunny day, they're a great place to go and chill out with some friends. But the purpose of today is to talk to you a little bit about the problems of growing food in a climate such as the UK 52 weeks of the year, and to give you some examples. So if you see a British grown label on some food in the supermarket, then perhaps you think, oh, that's great, I ought to buy British. But have you ever actually stopped to think about the problems that there might be if you decided that you were only going to buy British grown food? Could you buy British grown food 52 weeks of the year and have a really healthy, nutritious diet? Well, today we're going to explore some of the problems, some of the issues, some of the pluses and minuses about the problems that exist, but also how you might overcome them. So now I'm kneeling in front of two types of plants. They're both from the same plant family. They're both from the Apiaceae plant family. If you look over here, then you can see that there are a group of parsnips. You normally would eat the part of the parsnip that's in the floor, but this is the leaf that you can see. And the ones next to me are carrots. And again, a whole variety of carrots that you may or may not be familiar with. So if we just take one carrot here, out of the ground, this probably doesn't look much like the type of carrot that you would see in the supermarket. It's short, it's slightly misshapen because it's been growing around a stone, and it's covered in dirt. So this carrot would normally be a reject. It might go into food processing, it might just go into a skip, and that seems a waste of what is actually a perfectly good carrot to eat. There's nothing wrong with it, it just doesn't quite meet normal supermarket standards. So ask yourself if that should really be the case. Normally the carrots would be washed with high pressure water to clean off all the dirt, so that they're in a state that you normally see them in the supermarket. The other thing that you might want to notice just as we look around the horticultural gardens is that the vegetables are all growing inside a netted cage. This helps to reduce some of the pest pressure that the plants are subjected to. So obviously flying insects can get in a lot less easily. Having said that, if you carry on looking around the horticultural gardens, you'll see that some of the plants aren't in the best of health. There's evidence of disease, which we'll look at later, particularly on the brassicas, and you'll see that there are weeds growing and that sort of thing. This garden tries to avoid the use of chemicals as much as possible, but it still uses some. And perhaps that gives you an idea of just how much chemical you would normally use in a horticultural season in order to produce fruit and vegetables that look as perfect as those that you see in the supermarket when you go and buy things on a weekly basis. Okay, so you probably recognise these plants for once. These are beans, and we've got two different types of beans here. We've got the conventional runner bean that you can see is grown up a frame, and then on the floor we've got French beans, which are much shorter. So there are a couple of things that I want you to notice about this little patch. If you look at these beans, they're not really in a state that you'd want to eat them now. They're gone overripe. These are being produced for seeds. They're beyond their harvest date. Most of the crop has actually been harvested. And this brings me back to seasonality. You're used to being able to buy all kinds of fruits and vegetables in the supermarket 52 weeks of the year. And should we really be shopping like that? Or should we be shopping in a more seasonal way and eating fruit and vegetables that are in season at any given time? A bit later on, if you're saying, oh yeah, that's the way we should do it, then perhaps you want to think about whether we could actually meet our 5-a-day requirement from British grown crops in, say, February. So these are the beans grown up a frame. They happen to be purple beans, so the surface of them is very rich in anthocyanins. And growing them up a frame is quite a traditional way of growing beans in an allotment situation. But it's also being taken on much more, particularly in urban areas where there's a pressure and a popularity of trying to grow fruit and vegetables in areas where perhaps they wouldn't have been grown before. So we're seeing an urbanisation of the population in general and a need to grow crops in more space. There isn't very much more agricultural land available, and so we're looking at different areas that we can utilise to grow food. And one option is to do what we call vertical farming, and Emma will talk to you about that at some point during the lecture course. But it basically does what it says on the tin, that you can grow more things in a vertical way if you use height, as rather than just growing things in acres of fields. So that's one option of using height. The other option is to physically stack plants in like a box system, and that's where we might want to use the plants that are down here on the floor. These are French beans, and so they have tend not to be stringy like runner beans. They tend to be much easier to eat, much easier to prepare. They grow in a nice small space. They don't have problems of the climbing plants that sometimes can do, where they fall off their canes and they're messy and difficult to harvest. It's quite easy to look after and to harvest these guys. But again, you can see that many of the pods are beyond their best. Most of these are beyond harvest. And so it's not a crop that you would normally look to harvest at this time of year. You've actually got more there that's green because we've had a very warm summer and quite a long growing season. But quite often by this stage, there's just nothing left there at all. And so beans are off your menu. Beans, of course, are part of the legume family of plants, and you will hear more about those later on in the lecture programme, because they're a really important part of a balanced diet. And so bear in mind that if you want to have legumes in your diet, then you may have a limited time of year that you can do that if you're going to have freshly harvested produce. So another really diverse plant family is the cucurbits, and we're just scanning along here a whole bed of cucurbits of different types, and some of them you might recognise. So if we come down here, you can see, if I zoom in a bit, that we've got a marrow growing in there, just between the leaves. You can see the leaves look pretty rubbish, but the marrow looks fine. And then if we go across, there are different types of squashes. Something that you might be more familiar with is courgette, which you might grow at home. And they do tend to turn into marrows if you take your eyes off them. But if we come in down here, then one of the things that you might be able to see is something called an 8-ball courgette, which is a very round one, as a slightly different shape. And there are more conventional courgettes growing next door. And then if we move up the bed, you can see the bright orange things lurking in there, ready for Halloween. And so these are pumpkins. You'll see some nice pumpkin growing in here. Very orange pumpkins, those. And then, if I come out a little bit, then you can see this huge, great big specimen is a lovely pumpkin ready for Halloween. And in fact, an even better specimen is on the other side of the grounds. And you can get an idea of the scale against those pots there if I just zoom up so you can see the scale of everything. He's probably, I don't know, 2 feet across, something like that. So pretty substantial specimen. Some of these obviously are being grown as ornamentals, some of the gourds and things, but they're a pretty good source of food at this time of year. Most cucurbits crop in the autumn, with the exception of things like cucumbers, which you'll see growing usually under glass houses in this country. It's grown quite extensively down in Kent at an organisation called Thanet Earth, which unsurprisingly is at Thanet in Kent. And Thanet Earth is Europe's biggest glass house, and it produces cucumbers, tomatoes and peppers, more or less all year round. It's pretty quiet from November through to about February, but after that you're seeing a wide-scale production for the UK. And you can think about whether that's a good way of growing food in the UK, whether we should be producing food on these shores, or whether the supplementary heat and light that's required to run glass houses in the UK for that length of time is really something that we should be doing. This is maize. I'm sure you recognise maize. It's normally grown at high density in fields, and again it's a crop that came out of South America originally. And during the course of the lectures, Emma will show you how maize has been changed by mankind. It's definitely a plant that has exploited man. If you look at the original maize progenitor, which is something called teosinte, it was tiny, it had about 6 kernels, it was really hard and really difficult to eat. And now we have what you and I know as sweet corn, as this maize plant. And these cobs aren't the biggest in the world, and it makes me laugh when you see tins of naturally sweet corn, because there's not much that's naturally sweet about this maize. It's been bred naturally selected by man, subjected to a long-term conventional breeding program to give you the corn and the cob that we know now. So the cobs are in here. So the tassels here are the female parts of the plant that got pollinated, and each of these individual tassels, if I were to be able to tease them apart, goes down to a single kernel of the maize cob. And so the cob is in here. Let's see if I can destroy him a bit. So if I peel it back, and many, many layers of leaves, then you can just about see the top of the cob. And you can see that many of these have not been fertilised. It's not been a very good year for maize here, but further down in the bulkier part of the cob, you've got the fertilised kernels that look like the corn on the cob that you know. The male parts of the plant are at the top. And so these parts of the plant, these are the anthers, and they produce pollen, and they're mostly a wind-pollinated plant, so the pollen gets blown off of the top of the plant here, and eventually it falls, and because the female parts are lower, then the pollen lands on the female parts and fertilisation can take place.